Patanjali described Samadhi 2000 years ago, and almost no one reads what he actually wrote. What he gave was a sober map of the mind settling down, not a recipe for eternal ecstasy or a ticket out of the body. The people who later lived it, from a skeptical monk to a boy terrified of dying, described the same plain thing in wildly different lives. And the part the whole industry now sells you, the bliss and the superpowers, is exactly the part they warned would become a trap. So if Samadhi was never the prize they described, the question is what it actually is and why the effort to get there often stands in the way. Picture Samadhi the way most people do, and you get a man frozen in lotus with his eyes turned upward, communing with the divine in a way the rest of us aren't invited to. That's the image the spiritual marketplace has been selling for a good century. And it's almost entirely decoration. The word itself doesn't mean anything so grand. It comes from Sanskrit and means to gather the mind together, to collect it, to point it in one direction. That's the plain meaning, not merging with God, not leaving the body, not winning a prize reserved for ascetics in caves. Patanjali's system wasn't a miracle story. The famous line at its root is that yoga is the settling of the fluctuations of the mind, and Samadhi is the eighth and last step, the natural end of a long process rather than a bolt from the blue. He never describes it as a sudden gift of grace. It's what becomes possible when the earlier steps have done their work, when the body is steady and the breath is quiet, and the senses are no longer running the show. Then the centuries added ornament. Stories are created about superpowers, about levitation, about days spent without a breath. The texts themselves are far more careful, and where they mention these side effects, they treat them as sideshows. The Buddha reportedly called such powers child's play on the way to something else entirely. So the myth grew in the retelling, and the myth is what most seekers inherit. The most stubborn part of that myth is the suggestion that this state is rare, reserved for a few marked individuals, and that anyone else would need a lifetime of extraordinary discipline to come anywhere near it. That's the assumption to dismantle, and dismantling is the whole point of what follows. Before we dive in, if this kind of content resonates with you, come find me at luminaryflow.com. There's a free gift waiting for you. You'll find the link in the top comment below. Now let's get back into it. If the myth isn't it, then what actually happens? In reality, nothing. You can picture it this way. Think of a lake on a windy day with the surface chopped up into waves so that it reflects nothing clearly. That's the ordinary mind, running outward through thought and memory and desire and reaction, scattered in a dozen directions at once. And because it's scattered, awareness itself feels unclear and fragmentary. Now let the wind drop. The water goes still, and when it's still, it reflects the sky perfectly. That's the whole event. In other words, something is subtracted, the wind, and what was always there underneath becomes visible. The yogic texts describe this, except only from the inside. In Samadhi, the scattering ends, the mind becomes one-pointed, then transparent, then silent. And awareness is no longer pouring outward through the senses, but resting in itself. And here's the correction that matters most. Because the popular guess is always that this is some kind of blankness or sleep, and it's neither of those things. In sleep, awareness is dulled, and you wake up rested, but with no knowledge of where you were. In Samadhi, the body may be just as still, and the breath just as subtle as in sleep, but consciousness isn't lost. The reports across the traditions are unanimous that awareness becomes clearer than ordinary waking, not dimmer. Yogananda put it in his own way, saying the practitioner doesn't pass out, but instead finds a joy so complete that comes from within, rather than from the world outside. Then something odd happens to the very structure of the experience. In ordinary meditation, the awareness is focused on the object of the meditation, a breath or a mantra or a light, and is separate from it. In the first deep stage, which the text calls savikalpa, that distance shrinks to almost nothing, like the horizon when the ocean meets the sky, and the two seem to merge through a faint line that still divides them. A subtle sense of I am watching this remains. In the deeper stage, nirvikalpa, even that line goes, and there is no meditator, no object of meditation, no separation at all, only awareness. And nothing supernatural has been added to produce any of this. The noise simply stopped, and what was left was what was there before the noise began. And if nothing supernatural was added to produce it, then the people who reached it weren't supernatural either, which is exactly where the inherited stories start to mislead. The people who actually lived this aren't the figures the posters made of them, and this needs to be emphasized because the deifying is part of what keeps the state feeling out of reach. Take Yogananda, who's usually remembered as a beaming saint. What gets left out is that he trained for years under a teacher named Sri Yukteswar, a man whose manner was sober and unemotional and who demanded direct experience over blind belief. The Samadhi stage Yogananda later described came out of that disciplined apprenticeship, not out of thin air. He came out of it a trained practitioner under a notably down-to-earth master, not a floating miracle worker. Ramana Maharshi is the more unusual case, because he had no training at all when it started. At 16, seized by a sudden fear that he was about to die, he lay down on the floor, went completely still, and watched what death would actually mean. A question arose in him: what is it that remains aware if this body dies? The fear vanished, and with it the sense of being a separate person, and the rest of his life grew out of that single hour on a bare floor, with no guru, no scripture, and no method. Vivekananda came at the same territory from the opposite direction, with a questioning and rational mind that refused to take spiritual claims on faith. He described Samadhi as a superconscious state, the highest potential of the human mind, attainable through systematic discipline rather than a miracle handed to a chosen few. Now the stories about these people accrete ornament over time, bodies covered in ants, days passed without a breath, and some of that may be true, but none of it is the point. The point is that they were human beings who found a way to let the mind go still, and they aren't the only ones. Different generations, different paths, different languages, and yet the descriptions converge on the same thing: the fading of the ego, the loss of the fear of death, a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. So if ordinary people reached it, the harder question is why so many serious seekers spend decades chasing it and never arrive. And the answer to that is the paradox of the whole business. Here is the real twist. Try too hard and nothing happens. Don't try at all and nothing happens. And if your explicit goal is Samadhi, aiming straight at it is the one thing that won't get you there. The right mix is enough effort and yet not caring about the outcome. And that's a much harder thing to practice than it is to say. Ramana put it plainly, that your effort is the bondage, and that it's foolish to try to kill the mind by means of the mind. Because you see, the mind is simply fattened by every new thought you throw at it. The logic underneath that is obvious once you see it. Anything the separate self does to extinguish itself merely prolongs it, because the doing is the separate self in action. The desire to reach Samadhi is itself a desire, and desire is exactly the kind of movement that keeps the lake choppy. So the longing for the experience is part of the same machinery that prevents it. This is the paradox of effort that runs through nearly every serious path, and there is no clean way around it, because the one trying to get around it is exactly what needs to subside. That doesn't mean effort has no place. You sit and the mind wanders, and you return and you sit again, and over time the returning becomes less of a struggle. Effort can carry you to a certain point, and Ramana's phrase for what happens after that was to just keep quiet and let the rest take care of itself. This is why the method selling misses the point so completely. Any method will do if it's applied well, and none of them will do if you're holding on to the result, because that is the very thing the method was supposed to loosen. And there is one more trap waiting just past this one, which is the trap the entire spiritual industry is built around. The last bait and switch is the one the whole market is built on, which is the selling of Samadhi as eternal ecstasy. The texts do speak of bliss, ananda, but what they describe isn't a thrill. It's objectless and quiet, a peaceful fullness that arises when the mind's agitations stop, and the traditions are very clear that it's a side effect and not the destination. They even warn about it directly, that bliss itself can become an attachment, that seekers get hooked on meditative experiences and want to repeat them. And this very clinging is a subtle obstacle. A genuine practitioner, they say, doesn't cling even to the bliss. If you stay with this long enough, seeking the bliss states becomes the obsession, and then one day you notice that the bliss was never the goal, only a byproduct, and that the people who chased it hardest were the ones who never settled. It's easy to float in an ocean of light during meditation and call that the prize. It's harder, and it's the real work, to come back down and find that the world hasn't changed, and yet you have. This is what Ramana called Sahaya Samadhi, the state in which the clarity isn't something you visit on a cushion, but something you live in while you walk and speak and act with your eyes open. You don't measure it by how far you've traveled while your eyes were shut, or how long the stillness lasted. You measure it by whether the fear of death loosens its hold on you, and by whether the way you treat the people around you starts to shift on its own, without you trying to look like a better person. So there it is. The mind falls still and awareness remains, and that's the whole event. Nothing added and nothing taken away except the noise. They told you it was a secret reserved for saints in caves, but it really isn't. They told you it would make you holy, or lift you out of your body, or hand you powers the rest of us don't get, and it does none of that. It just shows you what was there before the racket started. The way the sky was always reflected on the water, even when the wind wouldn't let you see it. And you don't measure it by how long you sat, or how still the body got, or how far off your mind seemed to travel. You measure it by what remains once you stand back up and interact with the world. So the man who sat in lotus for years, and the boy who lay down on the floor, terrified of dying, they both got up eventually. And the world they walked back into was the same world it always was, only they weren't quite the same. If this resonated with you, come find me at luminaryflow.com. There's a free gift waiting for you there, and you'll also receive my newsletter with thoughts and inspiration behind each video. You'll find the link in the top comment below.